So this morning we will have two conferences. Our speakers are already here. I invite them to the front. Professor Colby Dickinson, who kindly accepted our invitation. We are very happy to welcome you among us. Professor Dickinson, I now will make a brief introduction. Professor Colby Dickinson is going to hold a conference titled Being and Acting, the Kingdom and the Glory, the Trinitarian Oikonomia, and the Bipolarity of the Governmental Machine. Professor Colby Dickinson is a professor of theology at the Loyola University in Chicago. He completed a BA in literature at the Truman State University. He also studied theology in the Duke Divinity School, as a master's degree in theology and religious studies, religious education at St. Louis University. Besides, he did a master's and degree and a doctorate at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. He taught religious education at a secondary school in St. Louis for several years. He have a few publications and research on the relationship between the contemporary thought in continental Europe and systematic theology, mainly focusing on the works of Walter Benjamin, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, and Paul Ricoeur. Some of his publications that we would like to highlight. One of the most recent ones is Agamben and Theology. We'd like to highlight Between the Canon and the Messiah, the Structure of Faith in the Contemporary Continental Thought. He is also the author of a work titled Saints, in quotation marks, Postmodern Saints in France, and the Formation of Tradition, Context, and Normativity. We have already had the privilege of conducting some interviews with Professor Colby Dickinson. One of them was in 2013 with the title The Structure of Faith, the Contemporary Continental Thought, and a second one on the same year with the title Agamben and the Close Relationship Between Philosophy and Theology. So Professor Dickinson, once again, thank you for having accepted our invitation and for bringing your contribution to our debates at this colloquium. Now, the way how we're going to proceed is this. We're going to have a presentation by our guest of about 1 hour and 15 minutes, and then after that we will have some time for Q&A, questions and comments. So, Professor Dickinson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very, very much for the kind invitation to be here. It's an honor to be here and to speak to you. So thank you for the lovely hospitality so far. And without much further ado, I will launch into my paper. So the title that I was given was Being and Acting, the Kingdom and the Glory, the Trinitarian Oikonomia, and the Bipolarity of the Governmental Machine, which captures a lot. I'm going to begin with a quote from a recent book by Bruno Latour, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, which is a fabulous book, and the way in which he situates economy as a fundamental issue regarding our existence and ontology, I think resonates a good deal with where Agamben is coming from. So I'm going to start with this quote from Latour. The question is how the whites, who thought they could teach the rest of the world the pure, hard rationality of economics, are still so imbued with that secular religion. Why do they continue to believe in another world above and below this one? A world that would not be the result of an organization, but the unfolding of a series of decrees to which we can only assent. In other words, why have the whites never extricated themselves from the old idea of an economy formulated by the Greek fathers, which designated the economy of salvation, that is, the distribution of the salvific work of God in the world, even while believing themselves to be materialists and atheists. End quote. Within Bruno Latour's discussion of the centrality of economy within Western thought lies the reality that has haunted theology for centuries. And when I say theology, as Latour points to, I'm referring to the white but also masculine, colonialist, and certainly dominant European theology. Why can it not shake loose the apparent or the apparently transcendent economy that governs it? If it is true, as Latour says, that one cannot both deny providence and reintroduce the supernatural of the economy, then why have so many efforts been produced, both theologically and in the secular era in which we live, materially, economically, to mask or veil the relationship between providence and the economy? Why introduce a secular religion, as he calls it, that only thinly masks the belief in a transcendent economy reigning from above? To answer these questions the answer to these questions is somewhat obvious, and so one that Latour himself articulates at times quite directly. There are persons or groups invested in maintaining a hegemonic hold over others, other persons, other groups, even over nature itself and the animal world. There are persons who are able to maintain their position of dominance and of power only by disavowing and thereby sustaining a relationship of oppression. The providential economy cannot be dispensed with, as so much in our world relies upon its relatively smooth functioning. It is a necessity for such acts of dominance. The dominant narrative, he adds, is really an illusion, grafted onto a much more complex reality, an illusion sustainable only because, in reality, providence, he says, does not exist. The empty space that providence is projected upon is merely an attempt to hold fast to a reality that otherwise would overwhelm humanity through its sheer vacuousness. Finding something like a moment of liberation for humanity, as well as for all other forms of life in our world, however, means learning to critique such an economy or providence of political theological relations explicitly tied to the construction of the Western human being. A point that in what follows I will be elaborating on at length through the work of Agamben. And I say here the notion of a human being, and I will refer in my paper to the notion of the subject, which I was just informed a few moments ago by the translator, in Portuguese can be one of two words. And I am explicitly invoking the ambiguity within the word in English, how both senses, I believe, both senses in Portuguese are being heard at the same time in the English use. So I am purposely using that ambiguity, both senses of the word in Portuguese and English, I think. Nonetheless, what Latour dreams of, and I think what Agamben dreams of too, is a world more honest with its motives, one that is willing, at long last, to admit its material and political interests, and therefore to cease transcribing them into reality with a theological imprimatur. The supposed secularists were really believers all along in a providential economy whose time is nearly past and not nearly soon enough. Quote, and this is Latour again, quote, If it took so many wars of religion before anyone could dream of separating state from religion, how many wars over the economy will we have to endure before we decide to separate ourselves from both the providence of the state and that of the market? When will we put an end to this long infantilizing, this situation of dependency, by becoming true materialists? Is it conceivable that those who thought they were teaching unbelief to the rest of the world and who boasted of their supposed secularization may finally learn economic freedom? End quote. And I have one footnote to make to this quote. As the president of my country, who is, I believe, an embarrassment to all Americans, Donald Trump, he's visiting the Middle East right now, and he presents a very interesting footnote to Latour's comment. Because in many ways, as you suspect, as you see, he has not an inch of true, let's say, religiosity within him. No sense of a belief in God. I think his God is himself, or is the market. It's providence, let's say. And yet in this ruse of religious belief that he sometimes presents, he has received the most support by evangelical Christians in America of any president in the modern period. More than George W. Bush, who at least had some religious sensibility of being a born-again Christian. Trump has none of this, but received more votes from evangelical Christians than any other president. Why? And I think Latour puts his finger on the answer, because the providence of the market aligns with the providence of these evangelical Christians. I think there is something to that. So that's a footnote, but I think it explains the point Latour is trying to make. So let me move to Agamben. The strength of Agamben's analysis of economic forms lies squarely in his ability to discern the manner through which a particular political theological nexus of relations ultimately founded and legitimated the Western subject as we know it. What we typically regard as philosophical and theological speculation is, for Agamben, in truth, a highly political discourse with genuine consequences for how our political reality is lived out. What the fields of theology, politics, economics, and philosophy today are to make of themselves after such a rereading of their primary operations remains to be seen. I will turn in what follows to Agamben's, to his book, The Kingdom and the Glory, because I believe it offers us the opportunity to re-examine relations between these fields and to provide another reading of reason or of order altogether. I will begin then with the division that he introduces between the kingdom and the government, as this distinction is pivotal for comprehending the scope of his rearticulation of the relationships between these fields. So from the start, the split between kingdom and government is one that is based on the division introduced in theological discussions of trinitarian oikonomia, the division between being and act, or praxis, or what became the essential division that established the trinitarian formulation of God's being into three separate but related actions. We say persons, but really he's saying it's fundamentally an action at its base. So three separate but related actions of the divine being, or persons as they were later known. The resultant dualism, predicated upon a certain Christological, political, theological reading, is very much what ultimately split formulations of the Trinity into ones that were dependent not on let's say, a Trinitarian scheme of representations, a threeness, but rather they were put into a dependent relationship to a binary representational system, a certain two-ness. thereby precipitating what Roberto Esposito, another Italian political theorist, what Roberto Esposito has referred to as a movement from an inherently ambiguous trinity to what he calls a binity, a dual notion of God. So he sees any notion of Trinity being politically, we say politically corrupted in a sense, into a binity. And he says that's what Christians truly worship in the West. This prevalence and subsequent insistence of the two within Western political history, and this is the name of Roberto Esposito's book, it's called Two. But also, as Ernst Kantorowicz's study of the king's two bodies illustrates, so this notion of the two is what will allow for relations of domination and subordination to usurp a perhaps more primordial undoing of binary systems of oppression, which earlier, let's say, earlier conceptualizations, earlier non-conceptualizations of the Trinity may have originally sought to promote. So, sort of a way to understand this, there is a way to use the notion of Trinity to reinscribe ourselves into dominant narratives of power, which are based on a fundamental dualism, the master and slave, in a certain sense. There's always a two, one is over the other. But there's also a way to read notions of the Trinity as fundamentally undoing all structures of power relations, the two-ness, and thereby inherently making things more ambiguous. This is part of the history of the contested politics of the Trinity within Christian tradition. So we are left historically then with a Christology that is imposed on a Trinity, a point that Agamben is no less quick to point out as remaining at the heart of established Trinitarian positions. In Agamben's words, quote, "This is the secret dualism that the doctrine of the oikonomia has introduced into Christianity, something like an original Gnostic germ, which does not concern the caesura, or the split, between two divine figures, but rather that between God and his government of the world," end quote. Agamben's reference to a Gnostic sense of duality and the concomitant distance which the divine could be said to display with regard to the sovereign's subjects who are governed with a bureaucratic efficiency and discipline is precisely what forces the division between the kingdom and the government into a stark relief within the history of antagonisms that have continued to define the fundamental operations of political theology. From the perspective of Carl Schmitt, the notorious political theorist and former Nazi party member, but from the perspective of Carl Schmitt, whom Agamben utilizes as his starting point for this genealogical study of the embedded dualistic structure of Western politics, there was the person of the sovereign. He who decides is how Schmitt defined the sovereign. There is the person of the sovereign who simply could not be eradicated from the foundations of a liberal democratic society, no matter how hard such a society might wish to eliminate the traces of the sovereign altogether. Though Schmitt may have been somewhat dismissive of a liberal society and the way it tries to litigate the everyday affairs of its citizens through the rule of law, what Schmitt decried as an endless conversation, there is yet an inseparable nature to the relationship between liberalism and sovereignty. Sovereign power, as embodied in the notion of the kingdom, exists in a permanent tension with its bureaucratic operations of governance, what Foucault had termed governmentality, and what Agamben takes up directly in relation to Schmitt's formulations of sovereignty. Through this, Agamben is able to bring to light a tension that neither Schmitt nor Foucault had fully theorized in their respective works. Put simply, Schmitt focused on sovereignty, Foucault focused on governmentality, but no one was able to bring them together and to say they exist in an inseparable tension between them. You have to have both. And this is what Agamben is trying to do in The Kingdom and the Glory. So the uniqueness of Agamben's study of this relationship between sovereign power and governmentality, its bureaucratic arm, this is what grants a heightened urgency to his study of the kingdom and the glory. For it is there that he most clearly describes the exact relationship between sovereignty and governmentality, as well as the many attempts to suture them together throughout the history of theological discourse. In fact, the notion of order itself, ordo, was in fact developed in the medieval period, as Agamben points out, as an attempt to, quote, suture this division by reproducing it inside itself as a fracture between a transcendent and an immanent order, between an ordinatio and an executio, end quote. As such, the providential transcendent hand of the sovereign may have established the rule of law and brought to life the tedium of governance, but it is the immanent regulation of life, or governmentality, which appears itself as if it were a grace fatefully given to humanity that undergirds the normative, operational, and bureaucratic order of society. In a sense, the coexistence of these mutually antagonistic spheres in the resultant oikonomia of this world is testimony to an unending attempt to heal, as he says, that's Agamben's word, to heal the fracture between being and praxis that cannot ever fully be healed. Much as the split, he says elsewhere, between philosophy and poetry cannot be sutured together. We somehow need both reflections, and we can't figure out exactly how they relate, but we know we need them both. At any rate, we are certainly left with the impression that the two go hand in hand, and that their appearance in this world is given in such a way as to offer themselves automatically legitimated, as if by God's hand. Quote, in other words, the governmental machine functions like an incessant theodicy, in which the kingdom of providence legitimates and founds the government of fate, and the latter guarantees the order that the former has established and renders it operative. My best example of this comes from a movie that I recently saw. So I'm going to take it to a very simple level here as an example. I took my son, who is 10 years old, to go see the new Batman Lego movie. I don't know if you get this down here. But you know the idea of Batman, this comic book hero. This film perfectly captures Agamben's point, huh? And my son grasped it. So you have the police chief who even says in the film, I am all about the rule of law. Law must dictate how we treat criminals. But of course, Batman, he's the sovereign. He's sovereign as man, as a rich man, and of course he acts outside the bounds of law. If you watch any of the Batman films, it's very clear. He will transcend the law because he somehow allows the law to exist, but really he is the true source of power and ultimately of justice. His decision and his ability to decide is what grounds the order of society. So we need Batman, though we also realize Batman transcends the rule of law. He acts kind of outside the law in order to bring true justice directly, which is, of course, the impossible ability to make a decision immediately as to whether a criminal needs to be killed or etc. But in the film, and it's a kid's film, we realize the true solution is that the rule of law, the police chief, who's a beautiful woman, has to be married to Batman. Yeah? The two have to go together. And this makes Batman frustrated, it makes her frustrated, but yes, we must operate this way. I mean, this perfectly captures not only, I think, the stereotypical characteristics of how men relate to women, men as sovereign, as those who decide, versus women who get caught up, as Carl Schmitt put it, in the endless conversations of liberalism that decide nothing. Think of how many women get stereotyped that way, huh? But this perfectly captures, too, Agamben's point. They go together. And this is how we dictate order in our world. Okay, so it's a simple example, but I hope that makes some sense. I believe he's articulating something along these lines. Carl Schmitt, for his part, had rightly discerned the necessity of a political theological conceptualization of sovereignty, but he had been too dismissive of the liberalism with which it was inherently eternally locked in tension. His temptation to emphasize one side over another, however, is not one that easily goes away. It is the temptation that lingers in every denunciation of powers that tend in one direction or the other, in many ways constituting the backdrop of an often binary partisan politics, this illusion that we must either all be part of one party or part of another. You can't exist somewhere in between, or it's not a reality. We are all tempted to go one direction or the other. From this point of view, there are, and seemingly will always be, let's say, the more conservative elements that stress the authority of decision and the resultant communal identity and one's fidelity to it as the only option. And there will be the more liberal elements that counter the conservative position with an emphasis on the democratic rule of law that seeks to provide equality for all. I think we see this, I certainly see this played out in American politics. I'm assuming we see this perhaps in Brazil as well, but I think many political systems are built on this structure. Quote, the providential economical paradigm is, in this sense, the paradigm of democratic power, just as the theological political is the paradigm of absolutism, end quote. And these are the tensions. The absolutist, say, autocratic temptation and the democratic liberal temptation. Yet in many ways, the suspension of rule that guaranteed the sovereign's power was fundamentally at odds with the legal structures upon which liberal society was based. And yet such a rule of law was not possible without a declared state of exception that allowed such laws to appear in the first place. A sort of political aporia appears to us through the existence of this binary machinery, in that we cannot resolve the tension that defines much of Western politics. The sovereign, in whatever form such sovereign power takes, maintains a distance from the everyday affairs of governance through its ability to render a decision that institutes the sphere for the rule of law, though the sovereign does not subsequently govern subjects himself. And I will perhaps occasionally use he or him to refer to the sovereign, but I do so intentionally, because what I just described, describes also the home in which I was raised, where my father makes all the decisions, but my mother actually runs the economy of the home. Yeah? This is the tension. This is the implicit meaning of the phrase analyzed by both Agamben and Foucault that, quote, the king reigns, but he does not govern, end quote. The sovereign is therefore, de potentia ordinata, subject to the law, while also, de potentia absoluta, not bound by it, not bound by the law. A principal distinction, as Agamben shows us, first drawn up by canon lawyers with regard to the limits of papal sovereignty. So this was first used to describe the Pope's sovereignty, and eventually was co-opted by nation states and monarchs to describe their sovereignty. The decision of the sovereign will appear henceforth as that which occurs as if by necessity, while the liberal democratic process will always by definition appear as if entirely contingent, despite its necessary existence as the correlate of sovereign power. And this play between necessity and contingency is essential here, because the decision of the sovereign will always appear as if necessary, whereas the democratic liberal process will appear always contingent. Could have gone a different way. That's the endless conversation it's caught up in. I think true sovereign leaders of nation states know this very well. When they act with force, they act as if it was by necessity. They say things like, we had to act. We could not act. Otherwise, they will think we are weak. We had to have resolve. We had to be focused and act swiftly. This is exactly how we characterize the sovereign, who acts as if by necessity through the fiat of their decision. The situation that results, we are told, is one wherein, quote, power, every power, both human and divine, must hold these two poles together. That is, it must be at the same time kingdom and government, transcendent norm and immanent order, end quote. The sovereign will always appear at a certain remove from the everyday operations of the world, while the bureaucratic governance will only be able to imply that the divine is disseminated and dispersed throughout all of creation. The conclusion introduces a perpetual temptation for theology, that one must either choose between an utterly transcendent and Gnostic deity, we could say, which is also sort of a deistic model, or one can assume the implications of an entirely immanent pantheistic God. Yeah, these are the two temptations we face. It's also why, as a theologian, I am never surprised that the theologians who most frequently challenge the sovereign vision of God, which is usually a male sovereign deity, these are usually feminist or queer theologians who choose to talk about how God is really a pantheistic motion, yeah, or a panentheistic option. Never fails. They always end up there. Yeah? Whereas the people who choose to emphasize, say, the strength of the communal identity of the church, they always sort of rest on a notion of God who's utterly transcendent of this world, in some sense. This is our Karl Barth choice. On a surface level, this choice between Gnosticism and pantheism, we are given to understand, must be rejected as a facile dichotomy, one that does not reflect the real stakes of the game. Gnosticism and pantheism are but two extreme positions embedded within the same machinery that produces the terrain of Western political theology. In this fashion, theology will never be entirely rid of either extreme, and should rather begin to discern why such positions seem to recur cyclically as the outgrowth of a permanent wedded tension between sovereign power and governance that can neither be severed nor eradicated. But we constantly go back to these themes. I'm going to reassert a sovereign God, or I'm going to reassert a pantheistic God, and we just keep coming back to these same options. In this inspection of what can only appear as a perpetually reoccurring theological heresy, or heresies, we must not forget, too, that the constant temptation we are faced with between Gnosticism and pantheism is one that likewise parallels the modern fluidity that would see the divine will, quote, annulled in the freedom of men, and the latter in the former, end quote. So that, as Agamben goes on to say, theology can resolve itself into atheism and providentialism into democracy, because God has made the world just as if it were without God, and governs it as though it governed itself. Various theories of secularization we might say, are still trying to resolve the implications of such movements that would see the modern rise of atheism alongside the elevation of the human will into its own divinity, much as Ludwig Feuerbach had already correctly noted. Though I should add, what concerns Agamben the most are actually the political theological implications of such movements. If God can be said to create the world through a sovereign gesture of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, and then to let the world govern itself such that modern humanity might begin to mistake itself for the divine sovereign and to replicate sovereign power within its own structures and institutions, then what are the political implications of particular theological formulations concerning God? And what remains of a possible divinity beyond such concerns? A somewhat unknown God, to be sure. What can be said likewise of a humanity that does not seek to imitate the sovereign deity? I will return to questions of a possible humanity and divinity beyond their historical theological signatures, turning first to the construction of a political theological order meant to ceaselessly unite that which is forever kept separate, the kingdom and the government. The attempt to conceal and yet to maintain such a tension between these two realms is very instructive, in that the order that it articulates is one that defines the role of rationality itself, and in perhaps far greater terms than most may have perhaps understood it. In short, the entire dualistic representational fabric of politics and theology, as much as of language itself, is given its particular raison d'etre, its reason for existence, through this political theological act which hinges upon an exclusionary inclusion, or what is elsewhere called an inclusionary exclusion, that depends upon its sacrificial machinery. The very basis, this sacrificial machinery is the very basis for the entire Homo Sacer project that Agamben has undertaken. And if you've read through Homo Sacer, the first volume, it's entirely focused on this exclusionary act that yet somehow includes the excluded figure in order to establish the order and politics of society. A series of dichotomies thus appear as founded upon the rationality that is produced through such an ordering of nothing short of reality itself. Quote, although the providential machine is unitary, it articulates itself into two different planes or levels: transcendence, immanence, general providence, special providence, or fate, first causes, second causes, eternity, temporality, intellectual knowledge, praxis. The two levels are strictly entwined, so that the first founds, legitimates, and makes possible the second, while the second concretely puts into practice, in the chain of causes and effects, the general decisions of the divine mind. The government of the world is what results from this functional correlation. End quote. The dichotomous logics that Agamben enumerates here are only the tip of the iceberg, as readers of Agamben's work have long known. These are not the only dualisms that are reproduced by such a scheme. There are also, besides the dualisms of immanence, transcendence, kingdom, government, we could even say male, female, besides these dualisms, there are the dualisms of potentiality, actuality, zoe and bios, constituent and destituent, potestas, auctoritas, law preserving, law creating, representation and presentation, word and gesture, necessity, contingency, and so on. These are all very, very central dichotomies to Agamben's work. Each of these dualistic frameworks brings an order to bear upon an irreconcilable split that Agamben, among others, wants to transgress through particular movements beyond a given duality's hold on our representational, linguistic, and also ultimately political contexts. This is why his turn to a form of life, and here I mean form of life with the hyphens in between, this turn to a form of life, or what he also calls a pure potentiality, must always exceed the boundaries of such constructed dualities and the order that they represent. Hence, Agamben can say, quote, ordo, or order, names the incessant activity of government that presupposes and at the same time continually heals the fracture between transcendence and immanence, God and the world, end quote. In truth, order attempts to heal the fracture between each of these dualistic pairings. So, how do we deal with the split? Just for example, how do we deal with the split between male and female, for example? Well, we give it an order. We say this is meant to be. There's some sort of potential hand in this ordering of society. We must have men making decisions over the women. That's how things work. That's the order we give to permanently or try to permanently heal the fracture that we perceive and which may not in fact really exist. Like Latour, Agamben's point is, these dualisms don't really exist. We make them. And then we pretend as if an order gave them to us. That's the invisible transcendent hand of the market, the economy, but also of the God who institutes the order that we perceive as natural. The existence of order in our world inherently conjures then an ontology, and along with it, concurrently, an ethics and a politics. I like to think of this as this is where Agamben outdoes one of his teachers, Levinas. You know, Levinas's critique of Heidegger was that Heidegger thought it was all about ontology, but really its ethics precedes ontology. And Agamben's move is to say, no, they all go together. You cannot separate the ethics from the ontology, from the politics, from the theology. They all happen at the same moment. Theology, then, for its part, has served historically as a pivotal, legitimating discourse for the various complex networks of relations that comprise such orders or cosmologies. So this is very important. Theology serves to legitimate this conjunction between the ethics, the politics, the ontology. Mythology, as one might expect, likewise serves a significant role in configuring, narrating, justifying, and transmitting these relations through space and time, for conveying that order as it transcends any one given location or history. The theologian James Allison, for one, has noted how the construction of a normative order relies upon a mythological narrative and the anthropological machinery of an exclusive inclusion, or what he calls a scapegoat, using a Girardian framework that he uses. This is the work of René Girard, which is very central to James Allison's theology. But he articulates this much in this manner that Agamben articulates as well. The history of theology that Agamben deconstructs genealogically is one indebted to such mythological structures and their liturgical rites of both power and glory. Much as René Girard's thought itself focuses on the manifestation of false forms of sacrality in our world in order to expose the violent mechanisms of domination and oppression, Agamben's aim is to reveal the emptiness that order founds itself upon and which it itself is. Quote, Order is an empty concept, or more precisely, it is not a concept, but a signature. That is, as we have seen, something that in a sign or a concept exceeds it to refer it back to a specific interpretation or move it to another context, yet without exiting the field of the semiotic to construct a new meaning, end quote. It is thus transferable and easily imposed on the subjects who inhabit a given field of social and political representations as the price to be paid for a shared symbolic intelligibility. The implication of such reasoning is that the transcendent order only refers to the immanent order, and the immanent order only points us back toward the transcendent order. They mutually reinforce each other and establish a series of relations that constitute what we consider to be the order of the universe itself, to put it in its most universally conceivable terms. But of course, theologically, mythologically, this is how we conceive of a cosmos, as granting a certain order and a naturalness to that order. Though the stress may fall from time to time upon one end of the spectrum, and often I would say for politically partisan reasons, they are inseparably intertwined and cannot be effaced. They are the representational coordinates that underlie the tension between kingdom and government, the sovereign and democratic liberalism. In a very precise manner, this political tension mirrors the theological one, taken up by so many theologians in the modern period, between natural revelation and what it must always and only refer to, the revealed discourse. So we see this in modernity. Almost every theologian is utterly concerned with the tension between the natural and the revealed. Yeah. Which takes precedence? So we see this again and again. What Agamben essentially clarifies is that the natural must point toward the revealed, just as the revealed could only point toward the natural. It's no mistake that theology has often been politicized through its division between those who stress the pluralistic essence of natural revelation. This is, of course, the liberal temptation embodied in someone like Schleiermacher, for instance, and those theologically who emphasize the sovereignty of revealed truth. It's more conservative leaning, as with, let's say, Karl Barth. Yeah? We see this again and again. And this is why Karl Barth can't stand the theology of Schleiermacher. He repeatedly attacks it, and then we see this happen in Catholic circles with von Balthasar, over and over. Yeah? This discussion of the metaphysical foundations of order, or of reason itself, then, is a major implication of Agamben's thought that grants us a complete rereading of modernity and its quest to liberate the sovereign subject through recourse to reason alone. Immanuel Kant's definition of the Enlightenment was, we should recall, dependent upon one's ability to overcome a state of immaturity, what is actually, in the German, better translated as a self-incurred minority. An interesting way to phrase things in light of Agamben's contention that order founds itself on the exclusive inclusion of a marginalized or minority figure. It's a very interesting way to phrase enlightenment for Kant. In Kant's words, quote, minority is inability to make use of one's understanding without direction from another, end quote. In reality, then, the formulation of autonomy and of establishing reason itself as the axis of one's subjectivity involves subordinating one's immaturity. So to be a rational, reasonable adult, you must subordinate the immaturity within yourself. You must be dominant over it in order to establish true reason and rationality as the adult sovereign subject that you need to be. Something we might easily link, I would say, to one's animality or one's weakness in whatever form it takes, in order to reign sovereign of oneself, to constitute the subject as sovereign. What Kant had denounced as oppressed and in need of liberation was a state that had not yet attained personhood, the true liberation he sought, thereby at the same time subordinating the non-person to the person who is a subject, who dares to reason without being dependent on another person's understanding. That is, the one who is rationally sovereign over themselves and who has no lack of resolution and who therefore dares to reason. This was the call of Kant's for the Enlightenment, sapere aude, be bold enough, dare to reason. This is the one who maintains complete freedom, while the non-person, the minority, remains in chains, and which became very quickly an all too real reality in the dismissed subaltern non-persons that were subsequently deemed inferior, immature, and to be colonized. This is the rhetoric of, read 17th century philosophers writing about the European discovery of Africa. These are children we've discovered who are deeply immature. They're really not even persons. They are subject to being enslaved because they don't reason the way we reason. They are not sovereign the way we are sovereign. As Roberto Esposito has already demonstrated, the modern machinery of personhood and the humanisms that accompany it in the West have been very active in establishing a certain percentage of the population as non-persons through the link established between sovereignty and the autonomous individual who reigns over themselves through the exercise of reason or of a mythological order, or said the mythology of reason. There is a circularity of reasoning, a tautology of sovereign power that cannot be ignored as foundational to this logic. Jacques Derrida had beautifully isolated this dynamic in his exposition of sovereignty in his book Rogues, though he deals with this later too in some lectures. But in his book Rogues, where this tautology served to legitimate that which cannot ever really be legitimated, and which was in reality an empty concept, something like the ontological reality, a bringing to life then of the emperor's new clothes. This is the case, as Agamben demonstrates in parallel fashion, because order, like glory, is both an essential attribute of the divine and also that which must be rendered to the divine by the humans who bear the imago Dei, the image of God, through the act of worship. This is the index of reciprocal relations that defines the inscription of power in relations of domination, and in no way leads to their deactivation. This is like when you ask someone why they are sovereign. The answer they give has to be, because I am sovereign. There's no justification for it. My footnote here as an example is years ago my wife was raised in a very evangelical, conservative Christian environment, and she was always told the man is the head of the household. And the answer she got when she would say why is because the man is the head of the household. There's no reason for it. It is reason itself. It cannot be justified. It is justification itself. That's a particularly powerful way to put it, but it's also very indicative of how we use those concepts to invoke sovereign relations in our world. That's why it's always a tautology. It refers to only itself. In the context of discussing Karl Barth's theological inscription of power, within his definition of glory, for example, Agamben discerns how, quote, the circularity of glory here attains its ontological formulation. Becoming free for the glorification of God means to understand oneself as constituted in one's very being, by the glory which we celebrate, the glory that allows us to celebrate it. End quote. This circularity ends only through obedience, inculcated and concluded through the institution of the church. The very same collective that, Agamben says elsewhere, has sought determinately to neutralize the messianic gesture that St. Paul found within the new experience of the word that deactivated or rendered inoperative its old use. So the church seeks to stop or suspend this messianic gesture. One's dignity and the highest freedom, Agamben says, are to be located in such an act of obedience to the glory of sovereignty, which is glorified because it is glorious. This is how he reads Karl Barth. From Roman imperial rites to mythological liturgies within the church that draw from and mirror their Roman forerunners, sovereign glory becomes manifest as that which is rendered to God at the same time as it is what emanates from the divine, offering the church a self-legitimating narrative for its own existence and exercise of its own sovereign power. It's important to note, however, and insofar as this will illuminate our comprehension of what is ultimately at stake in Agamben's thought, that he does give us an alternative vision of the church, and again through reference to Pauline thought. Agamben offers us at times something like a messianic vision of the church that is locked in a permanent tension with the governing economic force of law or state. The church, he elsewhere contends, must realize its messianic vocation or risk being, quote, swept away by the disaster menacing every government and every institution on earth, end quote. This menacing threat would seem to be something inherent to any given structure, and it is not entirely clear whether this somewhat Derridian gesture is a modern development or whether it will always haunt any given structure or institution. Nonetheless, by placing his critique of the church alongside the possibility for another messianic church to appear from within its mythological edifice is intriguing, to say the least. The distinction between these two forms of reciprocal glory, what has been historically understood as a division between external and internal forms of glory, is maintained, as Agamben claims, in order to conceal God's true substance, God's nudity, as he puts it. It's not entirely clear if this is a reference to God's ambivalence, God's inexistence, God's capriciousness, weakness, or sense that God does not know what God is doing, and so forth. But what is clear, at least, is that this formulation parallels humanity's attempt to conceal a lack of power, a lack of justification for the dominance that it wields over other humans deemed not human, or over the animals, or over nature itself. In this sense, the reciprocal nature of glory mirrors the reciprocal foundations of governance, as we find in Theodor Adorno's critique of bureaucracy as, quote, what rests on nothing except the fact of bureaucracy itself, and which is deeply resonant, I would add, with Foucault's analysis of governmentality. This is the fulcrum upon which Agamben's analysis depends. What is revealed through the analysis of the two forms of reciprocal glory is the fact that there is no secret to God's being, only an encounter with a reality that ceases to entice us into the machinery that produces the human subject, and which appears deceptively to us as that which is beautiful. As with Agamben's remarks on nudity and the beautiful, what we are actually searching for is an encounter with the human, we should say the human body even, that is shorn of the conditions of beauty, An existence, as Walter Benjamin had suggested, that is beyond all beauty, and therefore what registers as something like an encounter with the sublime. It is where nothing appears, an encounter with only the veil itself, Agamben tells us. Here, Agamben will conclude that, quote, it is in this way that in nudity without veils, appearance itself appears and displays itself as infinitely inapparent, infinitely free of secret. The sublime, then, is an appearance that exhibits its own vacuity, and in this exhibition allows the inapparent to take place, end quote. We are thereby returned to the empty gestures of sovereignty, but also the emptiness that remains in whatever being. That's his phrase, whatever being, or the form of life with the hyphens. The form of life lived beyond the confines of representation that we seek to encounter in the authentically ethical relation that Agamben is after. To be clear, this is also what remains in René Girard's thought after the false sacred has been eliminated. As Girard would put it, it's the empty tomb of Christ, upon which no violent or exclusionary community can be constructed. The reciprocal glory that grounds the violent mechanisms of power underneath a community's sense of itself are really no more than a thin veil that attempts to conceal a chasm of emptiness, nudity, as it were. Agamben is not hesitant to expose as such. Quote, does the distinction between internal and external glory, which reciprocally respond to one another, really constitute a sufficient explanation? Does it not rather betray the attempt to explain the unexplainable? To hide something that it would be too embarrassing to leave unexplained, end quote. Glory is, in this sense, like order itself, an attempt to suture the divide between kingdom and government, immanent and economic models of the Trinity, as well as being and action. The gesture that Agamben is making here is to suggest that the glorification of prayer that takes place doxologically and liturgically in order to conceal the gap between these various dualisms is the same gesture made through prayer that sacrifice too makes. As sacrifice is central to the anthropological machinery that Agamben wants to condemn, so too does prayer, he suggests, through its glorification of the divine, maintain the apparatus that would construct the human subject in a particular nexus of power relations. My simple example here, which maybe you will find funny, but again, my son who is 10, how does he perform these gestures of glory that grant him his subjectivity? Well, in everyday reality. As before I left, he played a football match, a soccer match, right? Where his team defeated the other team quite badly. So in that act of exclusion, because that's what sports teach us, huh? In that act of exclusion, he immediately turned to the crowd, and he gave a gesture of his own glory, which truly conceals the emptiness of his own insecurity. That's how we would phrase this. Rather than face the fact that he might have been on the losing team and been one of the boys who was crying on the other side, he chose instead to pronounce his glory, which is an absolute circular tautology. It only exists as an empty gesture for himself. But in that, he establishes his sense of dominance over the other team. This is what Agamben is talking about, in a very simplistic sense. In his essay, What is an Apparatus?, Agamben summarizes and contextualizes his archaeology of glory as one that revolves around deactivating the apparatuses that create and sustain the human being, such as language itself. Here we find a link to sacrifice even more fundamentally asserted than it is in the kingdom and the glory. In Agamben's words, quote, apparatuses are not a mere accident in which humans are caught by chance, but rather are rooted in the very process of humanization that made humans out of the animals we classify under the rubric Homo sapiens. In fact, the event that has produced the human constitutes for the living being something like a division, which reproduces in some way the division that the oikonomia introduced in God between being and action. Again, in this analysis, we are privy to the political theological justifications and doctrines that are as much an attempt to construct the human being in relation to language and its being dominant over the animal world and over nature, as they are about the divine. Though their focus, as with Trinitarian economic models, is often squarely distanced upon the transcendent realm. The distance which the human being now enjoys vis-a-vis its environment, thereby mirrors the distance that God takes from God's created world, theologically. Quote, from this perspective, one can define religion as that which removes things, places, animals, or people from common use and transports them into a separate sphere. Not only is there no religion without separation, but every separation contains or conserves in itself a genuinely religious nucleus. The apparatus that activates and regulates separation is sacrifice. Through a series of minute rituals that vary from culture to culture, sacrifice always sanctions the passage of something from the profane to the sacred, from the human sphere to the divine. End quote. The relationship between sacrifice and the creation of order, both facilitated through the discourses of religion, is cemented as the central machinery of Western subjectivity. The reason why any subject exists in the first place, and why the maintenance of the subject, theologically, but also philosophically at times, is so significant. The task of what Agamben calls profanation, to profane things, is tantamount to rendering the apparatuses that fabricate the human subject inoperative. It's to deactivate them. Only in such a way might we accede to a new understanding of the life lived without being inscribed into such relations. The form of life with a the entire Homo Sacer project has been toward from its inception. In light of the fact that Agamben's entire Homo Sacer series is guided by the presupposition that our of anthropogenesis at the end of a machinery that seeks to create the human being as subject, we are forced to inquire as to how reason itself, inherent in the processes that give us order against an apparent chaos, are indebted to the same forces of sacrifice that demarcate the exclusionary inclusion that defines the figure of the Homo Sacer. That is, to what degree is reason itself, or whatever rationality we employ, utilized to keep the chaos of our own animality at bay, to repress its truth? Still further, through the apparently mysterious existence and implementation of language. To give an order to human existence, to institute a hierarchical, categorical rationality of any sort, one might suggest, is little more than working of the same forces that allow humanity to dominate the animal world external to it, at the same time as the human being tries to master the animal within itself. The concept of hierarchy in the West, after all, originates in Pseudo-Dionysius and his attempt to sacralize a form of power that descends from the Trinity via the angelic triarchies to the earthly hierarchy, something easily extended in principle to the hierarchy of humanity over animality as well. In his book, The Open, as another instance where Agamben tries to clarify this relationship between the animal and the human, he had described the human being's animality as a zone outside of being, a space of agnoia, or not knowing, yet within whatever knowledge the human being constructs. He is not trying to forge a new creation between the human and the animal, so to posit a dialectical synthesis of the two somehow. Rather, he's trying to render inoperative the machinery that ceaselessly divides the one from the other in order to legitimate the human being's mastery over the animal and over the animality within itself. Agamben's conclusion on anthropogenesis in his book The Open is therefore entirely parallel with his conclusions in The Kingdom and the Glory. Quote, "Man has always been the result of a simultaneous division and articulation of the animal and the human, in which one of the two terms of the operation was also what was at stake in it. To render inoperative the machine that governs our conception of man will therefore mean no longer to seek new, more effective, or more authentic articulations, but rather to show the central emptiness, the hiatus, that is within man, separating man and animal, and to risk ourselves in this emptiness, the suspension of suspension, Shabbat of both animal and man," end quote. This suspension of suspension, or what Agamben will call in the context of St. Paul's thought, the division of division, is what renders identity, as we know it, inoperative. A suspension of the suspended lives that humanity lives in a recognizable political representational sense. Logic, ontology, and politics are all opened up anew thanks to this Pauline negative dialectic that Agamben continues to reformulate and articulate in new genealogical contexts as the real solution he is capable of pronouncing. The capacity to reason, as we define it, ceaselessly legitimates and justifies such an endeavor through its unending exercise. It's for this reason that logic itself must always rest on a metaphysical or anthropogenetic foundation or ground. This understanding was certainly apparent to Martin Heidegger in his lectures on the metaphysical foundations of logic, where ontological difference itself between being and beings was what grounded logic. Heidegger himself, who was, we must remember, at one point Agamben's teacher, was, however, almost entirely removed from the political consequences of such a connection, much to his own detriment, I think we would add, historically. What we see in Agamben, however, no less than in Esposito's discussion of the two, is that such a facile dualism is precisely what legitimates political relations of dominance and oppression. The unrepresentable within every representation, the unknowable within everything that can be known, the unthought within thought itself that yet grounds and sustains thought, what cannot be said within every word that comprises our linguistic capacity. All of these examples are things that cannot be pronounced and yet which make up the foundation for each representation, knowledge, thought, and word. They are highly political dualisms, even if they do not appear as such at first glance. What we are confronting in each situation is the unique linguistic characteristic of humanity that we cannot bring directly under scrutiny, much as we might like to, much as we cannot articulate the animality within the human being. That is, to speak the existence of language is impossible with words. And yet this is exactly what Agamben tries to say in and with his philosophy. Language has for too long assumed the role of being a singularly beautiful form, he says. One that yet, he corrects, does not inherently exceed what he calls bird song, the song of birds. Human language is not necessarily any better than the song of birds, and yet we praise it as infinitely more beautiful because we use our capacity for language to dominate over other species we believe do not convey languages. Though I think this is starting to change slowly in our understanding as we begin to discern, yes, animals do have languages, they're just very different than ours. And this teaches us something about our lack of understanding. Agamben thinks humans and their language have maintained a hegemonic hold over the rest of the animal world. That's how he puts it. Nonetheless, language and our linguistic capacity, the beautiful nature of words and our worship of them, has dominated human history, poetry, narration, and every literary and oral context in the history of the human being. If we follow Agamben more closely, however, we see too that language is also what has introduced a nexus of guilt and punishment into the realm of human existence. For, as he will conclude elsewhere, the fact that the human being stepped outside of its genetic coding in order to speak and thus to remove itself from the other animals around it is what has subsequently become the human species' original sin. It is the source of our guilt, that we are not like the other animals. And we don't know what to do with that, so we maintain a dominance over the rest of the animals. Language, sharing here a particular affinity with the pluralistic liberal order that we cannot remove ourselves from, is part of what Agamben calls the mysterium bureaucraticum, where Agamben sees humanity dwelling and something we cannot dispense with. Perhaps not until we get to the bottom of this mystery that finds us immersed in the bureaucratic apparatuses of language. Quote, the mystery of language and of guilt, that is, in all truth, of his being and not yet being human, of his being and no longer being an animal. End quote. Language, then, is that which allows us to provide an order to veil our dominance of our own animality and the animal world around us. As we see in a number of contexts within and around the Homo Sacer project, the political performative power of the oath is inextricably linked to what he calls the sacrament of language, with both playing vital roles in the maintenance of the anthropological machinery of the West, developing the political, theological nexus that legitimates its dominance through the formation of the human subject, the human person. According to Agamben, the time has come to render profane this sacramental bond, this theological signature that has been so central to Western legal codes. The deactivation of this machinery, this is his phrase, the deactivation of this machinery, our capacity to render it inoperative, to cease its functioning, will be possible through a messianic suspension of the suspension, or the state of emergency, that undergirds the decisive power of the sovereign. Uniquely, it is philosophy that will be able to provide such a critique, as he illustrates in his genealogical study, The Sacrament of Language. Quote, philosophy is, in this sense, constitutively a critique of the oath. That is, it puts in question the sacramental bond that links the human being to language, without, for that reason, simply speaking haphazardly, falling into the vanity of speech. In a moment when all the European languages seem condemned to swear in vain, and when politics can only assume the form of an oikonomia, that is, of a governance of empty speech over bare life, it is once more philosophy that there can come in the sober awareness extreme situation at which the living human being that has language has arrived in its history, the indication of a line of resistance and of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dickinson, for the conference. Thank you to the translator. And we immediately have now some time for questions, contributions, comments. So you have to use the microphone, if possible, come to the front to make the recording also of this session easier. Good morning. I'm José Roque. I'm professor of bioethics here at the university. Thank you for the consistent analysis of Agamben. And I have a question. The various volumes of Homo Sacer, evidently they don't have an evolution. They are there is a total circularity beginning with Homo Sacer, bare life until the last volume. But there are two perspectives that I think are one more at the beginning in the first volume of Homo Sacer, with the analysis of the sacrificial machinery, which is also an anthropological machinery, which you mentioned. As you said, it's the origin of all dualisms between human and divine, man and animal, and all other dualisms that we can analyze. And behind this dualism, or behind the sacrificial machinery, is ultimately the issue of transforming something from the value of use to the value of exchange. I think behind the sacrificial is particularly the issue of the exchange value. It has to transform the value of use into the value of exchange. I think that is ultimately the sacrificial dynamics. And the deactivation of that, and you talked about this at the end of your paper, is the issue of messianism, which means to recover power or potency, which means to bring the value of use back, which is very much related to what capitalism, the market are. In one of the last volumes of Agamben, The Use of Bodies, there he proposes in a way an ontology of use. And if I can recall, in your book on Agamben and theology, you have one chapter which is called the ontology of the particular, or the particularity. So this, I would like to ask you this: what is the relationship between what Agamben calls ontology of use, and which you quote as ontology of particularity in your book? What is the relationship of that to the issue of messianism? How do these three things that can deactivate the sacrificial and anthropological machinery, how are these three things, power or potency, the particular, and the use, how are these three things interrelated?
Thank you very much for a very good question. I plan in my second talk tomorrow to say more about the messianic, but I will say a little bit now. First of all, it's complex because Agamben is afraid that by mentioning the particular, and this is how he talks about it earlier in his work, that he's going to fall back into the dualism, the facile dualism of universal and particular. And he wants to sort of escape that dualism. So this ontology of particularity that I think he does speak about is really something like an ontology of a particularity beyond the dualism of universal and particular, which sounds very strange, but he has this problem repeatedly. His dualism between actuality and potentiality, he wants to go beyond, and yet he wants to champion what he calls a pure potentiality, which somehow goes beyond the dualism. He certainly wants to, as you pointed out, he wants to invoke this notion of use as opposed to possession in order to demonstrate the possibility of something like a pure potentiality. And this pure potentiality is the form of life with the hyphens, but it's also what he calls in his book The Coming Community, the whatever being. Yeah, he says it's a whatever being, a being that is so particular or so indebted to its own peculiarity, its own particularity, that it cannot be classified or categorized. It seems to transcend the realm of representations, categorization, anything along these lines. And Agamben wants to go toward that, to embrace something like a figure, a form of life that cannot be described in language, or as he says, it cannot be captured or trapped by language. Well, this puts Agamben in a very difficult situation because he wants to provoke the possibility of going beyond all representations, so therefore going beyond language. But he wants to say this is possible with the words and the language that he uses. So early in his work, before the Homo Sacer series, he found himself in difficult territory where it seemed as if he was promoting some sort of antinomian position, going beyond all law, all representation. And he certainly wants us to try to think going beyond all those forms. That's why the messianic is very important to him, because the messianic gives us the possibility of rendering all identities as if we had no identity. We move beyond all identitarian thought. Okay, but practically speaking, how do we do that? He struggles with this a little bit more. It's not until this final volume, The Use of Bodies, that you mentioned, that he says, well, what this really is something like a use, but not a possession. I'm able to use an identity, but I'm not going to possess it. And this resonates very deeply with St. Paul's thought. That's why he loves and always returns to St. Paul's thought. Because St. Paul gives us a method to think the deactivation of every identity, no longer Jew, no longer Greek, no longer male or female, no longer slave or free. We are beyond every dualism. And yet, and so, you can return to every identity to make use of it, as St. Paul says, to win souls for Jesus. That's the idea. So I can be a Jew to the Jew and a Greek to the Greek. It's okay. That's the messianic logic. And Agamben is concerned because that true deactivation of every identity can be so easily reinscribed back into an ecclesial or any institutional hierarchy. It's very easy for the church to then say, well, now you are a Christian. And now we're going to say there are Christians and there are not Christians, and the Christians are saved and the not Christians are damned. This defeats the messianic logic, which is a revocation of all identity. So it's the complexity is that Agamben wants to think the form of life or the deactivation of identity or the whatever being. He wants to think that as it exists within every identity. So within every identity that already does exist, there's a possibility to deactivate that identity. We can make use of that identity, but we do not possess it. And I think that's the distinction that he's trying to draw. But I could say a lot more about this, and it's very complicated. But I think I hope that gets the sense of what you're asking about. And I will say more about the Messianic tomorrow, but that's a crucial piece for Agamben's ability to render inoperative every identity we are given. You're exactly right to point to it's a use, not a possession, and that's the main difference that Agamben is after. And it does directly affect how we perceive economy and markets and the identities and representations that they give us. Yes.
Obrigada. Nós temos mais uma pergunta para o professor Cláudio.
Professor Dickinson, thank you for your paper. I'm Claudio Ribeiro from the Methodist University in São Paulo, and I would like to ask you about the place of the dimension of chaos in theological language, which is a concern of ours in our reflections. You talked about the order, and in fact, we are heirs of a theological language that is ordered, systematized in the Western and European trajectory, particularly the so-called great European theologians, Barth, Tillich, regardless of the theological orientation. But the central core is the systematization, is ordering. And we see, particularly in our Brazilian and Latin American context, a kind of explosion of language based not on concepts, but on narratives, on experiences, on descriptions connected to everyday life. And this, in my view, is part of this tension that Agamben talks about poiesis and praxis. Just to quote an example, Brazilian theologians such as Rubem Alves, for instance, are opposed to the idea of a systematized theology in order to include the dimension, a poetic dimension, a poetry, also in the field of feminist theology, which he referred to. So there is a whole effort to introduce into theological language the descriptions and the interpretations of everyday life and of corporality. The Catholic female theologian Yvonne Gebara tries to do that. And also in the feminist field, within the Protestant tradition to which I belong, we have an Argentine theology already deceased, Marcela Althaus Reed, who also performs a kind of explosion of language akin to James Ellison, who is very dear to us here in Brazil for obvious reasons, and who talks about making a theology outside of the closet, which is the phrase in Portuguese, in order to express the authenticity, in order to accept the conditions of life as it is, within from the perspective of homosexuality. In the case of this female theologian I referred to, Marcela Althaus Reed, uses the phrase that disorganizes our thought, that denormatizes our thought, that destabilizes our thought because of the chaotic force of language, which is a theology without a pantyhose, without underwear, so to say. So I would like to hear your view about this now going through Agamben. So what would you consider to be important for the theological language or the theological method, this explosive or chaotic dimension, a perspective which can be generating, because the world is the fruit, as the result of an explosion. Also, how do you see the place of this chaotic dimension in theological language? Professor Dickinson, it was a pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much for your brilliant talk. I am Glauco. I am a professor of the Pontifical Catholic University in the Religious Studies Graduate Studies program. My question is brief. Actually, I have several questions, but I'm going to ask only two questions very briefly. Homo sacer and is the figure that does not say about itself, that cannot say about itself. At another point, you bring a proposal, or the reading that you make of Agamben is the reading according to which Agamben proposes a messianic solution for the suspension of the law, for the state of exception. Is there any association between Homo sacer, who is the figure that cannot say about itself, to whom language does not apply except in an external manner, and the suspension of suspension itself? This is the first question. The other question, which is also very laconic, very brief, but it's a question that has to do with the discussion that we find in the kingdom and the glory. It has to do with the presence of God in the world, in the binary world, in the dichotomous world. So the question is Agamben looking for God in contemporaneity?
¿Puede ser en español o en inglés? ¿Sí? No. ¿En español?
English would be great.
Sí. I would like to ask you about the Trinity, because we are agree that Agamben do not put the Holy Ghost in his analysis of the Trinity, no? And with Esposito, you try to show that that Trinity is maybe a duality, no? But what if the Holy Ghost is the spectral strength with the one the machine works? Maybe we could have a bad Trinity over there. I don't know if you understand. Not a duality versus a Trinity, but a Trinity that the Holy Ghost, the function of the Holy Ghost is in the intermezzo between the duality, making the machine operative. No? That's the spectrality of the Holy Ghost, maybe, no?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you for these questions. These are wonderful questions. I'm going to bring the last question into the first question, or the first reflection, because there is another way to think the Trinity than as Agamben analyzes genealogically in the kingdom and the glory. But that's not something he talks about. He just leaves that out. So the Holy Spirit is the missing figure. We don't have a pneumatology that Agamben is really going into here. I think that's also why Eastern theologians are somewhat absent from his reflections, because he's concerned about how this political theological nexus works in the West. But that does not account for the East, and it does not account for, let's say, the queer or liberation or feminist theologians who are trying to read the Trinity as a disruption of binary systems. I think the use of Marcella Althaus-Reid is very appropriate, because she is just one example of a theologian who sees the Trinity as a disruptive figure, disruptive of any dualism or any binary way of thinking. And for that reason, I think this is why she quotes very favorably Agamben's work in multiple places. In The Queer God, for example, Althaus-Reid makes good use of Agamben in very crucial moments in that text to represent the disruption of representational ways of thinking. So my reading of Althaus-Reid is actually very close to Agamben. I think they are doing something very similar. And I think for that reason, they both run the risk of getting caught making claims that sound a bit more, let's say, exaggerated than can actually be lived out, let's say, in an ecclesiology. But Althaus-Reid says in The Queer God that this is a rhetorically effective strategy. And I think very much that's what Agamben is doing too at times. I think he would hate if I said that, that he's just trying to be rhetorically strategic, or provocative. But I do think there's a certain level at which Agamben's work functions in that way. And that's very similar to how Althaus-Reid functions. This is more anecdotal, but I remember meeting with Agamben in Paris, and I asked him about his views on the church, and I said that it seems that your work in many ways points to the absence of church, or there should be no church. Should we have no church? Should it be gone? And his response was to say, almost as a on the side, an aside comment, I think this is a very surprising moment for the church. This is a chance for the church to do something very spectacular. It's an opportunity for the church, to grow in a very different way. I'm not quoting, but he was looking towards something different for the church. And I think he's correct in that sense. We have to think differently about how we do theology and how the church understands itself. But it's difficult to do because it's going to take a certain rhetorical performance to shock us and provoke us to think differently about the nature of what the church is. So that's a piece of this. And so I could say a lot more about the split within theology between narrative and systematics, but let me try to connect that to the second series of questions. Asking about the presence of God in this world. I don't think Agamben is too concerned about asking questions of where can God really be located. I think he more or less takes a pantheistic or panentheistic approach in some sense. I think what he's trying to suggest, though, so speaking to your question about finding God, is that the only way we would be able or capable of accessing something like a presence, whether of God or of another person, I think it's very similar to him in this respect. The only way to encounter a genuine presence is not through what we take as, here I am presenting my presence to you, and I am successful in that presentation. No, the only way to encounter a presence is through the failure to represent something. So in that crack, where you have failed to show a genuine representation, that's the moment you come closest to actually seeing what something is. So where would you find the presence of God? Only in the places where you show your failure to represent God. That's where you come closest to actually finding the presence of God. So Christianity then is very important to Agamben because it's the moment where a religion shows the failure to present God the way we thought God should be presented. And in that failure, we come closest to seeing God. But ironically, in that failure, we come closest to also thinking there is no God. We come closest to seeing the death of God. But that's the most genuine chance for encountering the presence of God at the same time. And I think it's very complex, but it's something along those lines. So just very quickly, then about your first question about what is this suspension of suspension, it functions very much like that. It should not be a moment where we are able to suspend rule so that we can give a new form of sovereign authority or power or a new representation that this time is real. No, that's always a failure. All we can do is suspend the suspension itself. And in that failure to identify something, in that failure to represent something, we might begin to see for the first time what the person really is. So in my simple examples, when do I most clearly see my son, my football playing son? I don't see him very clearly when he stands up and brags about being a good player. I see him when he cries because he failed to be the thing he wanted to be. Yeah? That's when I see who my son really is. It's only in his inability to be the thing he wants to be that he can show me who he is. So in the classic dualism of male-female, when am I most likely to show who I really am? Is it when I am really a man and I show my most manliness in my behavior? No. It's when I articulate or I show where I fail to be a man that I show who I really am. Otherwise, I'm just posturing, I'm pretending. And there's nothing really there. There is no manliness. That doesn't exist. I can only be myself, a whatever being, when I fail to be a man. And in that brokenness, where I don't even know what to call this, you can genuinely, or most, we hope you can most genuinely access who the person is. And that would be something like where to encounter the presence of the divine or the presence of the other person when they fail to be what you thought they should be. Something like that.
Thank you very much once again for this instigating reflection. And we're glad that tomorrow we will be able to hear you again. The other speakers are all with us, Professor Castor, Rodrigo Carmi, Professor Gignac. So now we're going to make a 10-minute break, and then we resume our reflection and our debate.